Ukraine gears up for presidential elections amid ongoing violence in the east of the country. Russia's President Vladimir Putin says he does not expect a new Cold War over Ukraine. Bahrain's leading human rights activist Nabil Rajab is freed after 2 years in prison while the government continues its violent crackdown on dissent. And Thailand's military leaders disband the country's Senate, assuming all political power. Hello there, you're watching Ali Tijah World News and I'm Fatima Bassin. Preparations for Ukraine's presidential elections are underway as an electoral silence took effect ahead of Sunday's poll. However, as millions of pro-Russian separatists are refraining from voting, the results are not expected to be representative of the entire population.
Ukrainian authorities are preparing to hold the country's presidential elections, slated for May 25th on the heels of a crisis that has plunged Kiev into political turmoil. Some 34,000 polling stations have been set up for the 36 million eligible voters and will open from 8 a.m. local time until 8 p.m.
25 травня ми йдемо на вибори.
Dear compatriots, on May 25th we're going to go to the polls to elect the head of our state. We will vote for freedom, success, and European future for which Ukrainians have paid the highest price, the price of their lives. The choice that we will make on Sunday is important, and so is the responsibility vested in each one of us.
However, the vote is expected to be representative only of the general opinion in Kiev. As to the east, the recently pro-Russian seceded regions of Donetsk and Luhansk are boycotting the elections. The U.S., for its part, has expressed its support for pro-Western candidate Yulia Tymoshenko.
We want very much to be in Ukraine, to be supportive not only of the elections, but of all the work that is going to have to take place afterwards.
We won't let anyone disrupt the elections, and we think the presidential election is a really strong stabilizing factor for Ukraine.
Meanwhile, in Slavyansk, where clashes have been erupting between Ukrainian troops and pro-Russian activists, a cloud of cautious calm hovered over the eastern city.
I am frightened because we are being bombed heavily. Our people bomb our people. How are we to take this? I don't know.
The 21 candidates running for the post are laying low now as election silence went into effect 1 day ahead of the vote, which will see a new president come into power in Kiev amid an ongoing political crisis.
Amid the ongoing turmoil in Ukraine, millions are expected to head to the polls to elect the country's next president. Zainab Alawiya gives us a brief overview now of those elections and some of the main contenders vying for the top job.
Despite the ongoing violence and political instability plaguing the country, Ukrainians are heading to the polls to vote in presidential elections. More than 36 million Ukrainians are eligible to vote. However, this figure includes both Crimea, which voted to join the Russian Federation in March, as well as the eastern regions of Luhansk and Donetsk, where anti-Kiev protesters declared self-rule following an independence referendum earlier this month. Thus, millions of ethnic Russians living in eastern Ukraine are unlikely to take part in the election. Now, these are just some of the faces contesting those polls. You have the clear frontrunner. He's 48-year-old Petro Poroshenko. He's a billionaire, otherwise known as the Chocolate King for his vast confectionery empire. Poroshenko has pledged to find a peaceful resolution to the crisis threatening to dismember his country, as well as to rebuild ties with Russia. Opinion poll sees likely to garner 30% of the vote. Petro is far ahead of the deeply divisive former darling of the 2004 Orange Revolution, Yulia Tymoshenko. Now, she's a former prime minister and leader of the Batkivshini political party, and she's the most influential female politician to have emerged from the former Soviet Union. To her supporters, the 53-year-old leader is an unflinching defender of Ukrainian sovereignty. But opinion polls only give her 6% of the vote. Next up, Mikhailo Dobkin, who is the former governor of Ukraine's Soviet-era capital Kharkiv in the east, was nominated by the Party of Regions. Now, the 44-year-old is a one-time businessman who once followed through with separatist ideals, but now he supports what he calls a united Ukraine. Polls give him just 2.6% of the vote. Now, other notables, including pro-Russians and ultranationalists with less than 4% in opinion polls, include Sergei Tahipko, who he's re-established an old political party called Strong Ukraine. The 54-year-old is a former governor of the central bank and is keen to rebuild economic ties with Russia, whose gas supplies are vital for Ukraine. Then there is 42-year-old Dmitry Yarosh, the leader of the far-right neo-Nazi party Pravi sector, who harbors deep resentment towards both ethnic Russians in Ukraine as well as Russia itself. Yarosh is currently the head of the so-called National Guard, which is spearheading operations against anti-Kiev protesters in the east. Then there's Oleh Tyenibok. He's the leader of the ultranationalist Svoboda party. Following the violent ouster of President Yanukovych, the 45-year-old former Surgeon's party secured crucial portfolios within the interim government, including the post of deputy premier as well as defense minister. Now, he rose to prominence as a leader in the Maidan protest movement. Well, despite the radically different political scene that has emerged since the so-called Maidan protests, there are no fresh faces among these leading candidates. One of the tasks of the new president, who will be elected to a 5-year term, will be to set the date for elections for the 450-seat parliament. If no candidate garners more than 50% of the vote, a runoff will be held on June 15th. The election is the 6th presidential vote since Ukraine became independent, with the disintegration of the Soviet Union in 1991. But it remains to be seen whether the polls can bring stability and prevent the breakout of an all-out civil war. Kiev's critics say that the elections are little more than a farce aimed at legitimizing the rule of a coup-installed government.
During the second day of the St. Petersburg Economic Forum, Russian President Vladimir Putin has expressed Moscow's concern over threats from Ukraine's far-right groups to disrupt the flow of Russian gas supplies to Europe.
I really would not like to think that this is a beginning of a new Cold War. I think this is not going to happen. We think that the West tried to talk to us in the language of force, and we, using the same logic, gave a reasonable answer. But I hope that this will never, under any circumstances, happen again anywhere.
Putin also said that he believes that a new Cold War is unlikely to take place. According to the Russian leader, there is no appetite for another prolonged East-West confrontation.
I really would not like to think that this is a beginning of a new Cold War. I think this is not going to happen. We think that the West tried to talk to us in the language of force, and we, using the same logic, gave a reasonable answer. But I hope that this will never, under any circumstances, happen again anywhere.
To discuss more on Ukraine's presidential elections, let's speak to political analyst Robert Olds. Mr. Olds, now, how could authorities in Kiev say they want unity among Ukrainians when most of the presidential candidates are anti-Russian or at the very least pro-Western?
Well, it's an absolutely farcical situation. There was a democratically elected president, President Yanukovych, who was elected freely and fairly in 2010. He was ousted in a Western-backed coup, largely supported by the European Union and the United States. And of course, he recognized that Ukraine was very diverse, that there was interest, that wanted to have closer ties with the EU and the wider Western world, and other people in the East and Crimea really looked towards Russia for often very good reasons, very strong cultural, political and religious reasons, as well as economic reasons. So that was understood by him. But none of these other people recognize the diversity of Ukraine, and they want to impose their will, the will of the mob that's currently running Kiev and the Ukrainian state in the West, imposing their will on the East. People who do not want to be part of Ukraine, do not recognize the expansion of the European Union and the United States influence into their country. So really, it cannot be working as a political entity when the country is so diverse and there is just one lot the people who currently have power in Kiev wanting to impose their will on the east of the country.
But could we ever see Kiev-Moscow ties improve again, given that one of the contenders, Petro Poroshenko, said he will rebuild ties with Russia?
Well, whilst people are making words about having closer ties with Russia and having cooperation with Russia and rebuilding the relationship, at the same time, the Ukrainian army is killing people in the east who are resisting the rule of the Kiev authorities. They are cooperating with extremist paramilitaries who are deeply unsavory people. And this is being supported by this very same people who want closer ties with the West. So that cannot really continue. There cannot be closer ties with people who want a good relationship with Russia, the people in the east of the country that want to have their own autonomy from the rule of Kiev. And at the same time, the forces that currently run Kiev are killing people in the east.
So will these elections give Kiev further legitimacy to crack down on pro-Russian activists in the east?
Well, the previous president was legitimate because he was elected, but he was overthrown. These elections will not give legitimacy because in the east of the country, they've already said, we do not want to be part of this Ukraine if this Ukraine is about being inside the European Union's orbit and, of course, having closer ties with the United States. They don't want to have a part of that, and they are rejecting anything to do with the EU, and they want to have their own sovereignty, and it's for them to determine their own future. They are not taking part in these elections. They do not recognise the authority of any president that will be elected as a result of the elections in Ukraine tomorrow. So the opportunity has been missed. The Western interference in Ukraine, the destabilisation of the previously elected government, has created a situation where the country has now fallen apart. It is effectively a failed state. Crimea has gone. They've expressed their will to join with Russia, and now they have united with Russia in the east. They've already had referenda showing that they actually want to have their own regional autonomy and their own self-determination, and have asked to become part of the Russian Federation. Ukraine has already failed as a state. It has been wrecked by Western interference. And so basically, any election will not have a government that can unite Ukraine. That just cannot happen. It is over. Ukraine really does need to divide now.
But how do you think Moscow will deal with this new government? Putin already said he will respect the results of the elections.
Well, President Putin will, of course, always be willing to liaise with any government that's elected in Kiev and will talk with them. That is now, their channels will be open for communication. That will always happen. But the fact remains is that East has already expressed its desire to go a separate way. And that is the ultimate conclusion. There was a chance for a united Ukraine. That existed a few years ago when President Yanukovych was really trying to build up his plan to have a trade agreement with both Russia and the European Union, and to try and ride both horses, as it were, and try and create an agreement which could satisfy both sides in what is a deeply divided society. That was not accepted by the West. They refused to support those measures that would see Ukraine neutral between Russia and the European Union because they wanted to bring Ukraine fully into the EU's orbit. He has now been ousted, and the deep divisions in society have come to the fore. And there's been fighting and killing, some cases innocent protesters, peaceful protesters, and there's some very unsavory elements that have come to the fore in Ukrainian politics. It really has gone too far. There can really be very little hope for a peaceful resolution to this crisis inside a united Ukraine. Ukraine has effectively failed as a state because the people in the East want to have a different future to what the people in the West want.
Yes, now, although Putin did say that Russia's actions towards Crimea were reasonable, he also said that he hoped it would never happen again. Does this mean that Moscow won't be incorporating parts of eastern Ukraine?
Well, at some point, that may well happen deeper down the line and in the long-term future. The east of Ukraine is largely self-governing now. It doesn't really accept the rule of the authorities in Kiev. It's developing its own armed forces. Local politicians have come to the fore that are determining that as the Kiev does not rule in the east of the country. So really, ultimately, the separation of Ukraine needs to be accepted. Now, at some point in the future, it may well happen that they do decide to join the Russian Federation. They've already requested to do so, and that may be accepted in the long term. In the short term, Russia is not going to invade Ukraine. That was actually never on the cards for Russian forces to go into the east of the country and take it over. That was a really hysteria generated in the West about Russian influence, when what was actually happening is people in the east of the country have risen up against what they see as an illegitimate government that was installed in Kiev, just like people in the west of the country rose up against President Yanukovych and overthrew him in a violent Western-backed coup. The East then said, we do not recognise the rule of this new authorities. And now they are running their own regions. The Donbass region, the productive parts of Ukraine in the East, are now self-governing and independent. And that really does need to be recognised, that Ukraine has failed as a state. And so what happens in the future, it may well be the case they join Russia, although there's not any plans for Russia to send in troops. That was actually never on the cards.
All right, political analyst Robert Olds, thank you for speaking to Ali Tija.
Thank you.
Prominent Bahraini human rights activist Nabil Rajab was released from prison after spending more than 2 years in detention. Rajab was initially sentenced in August of 2012 to 3 years in prison for advocating peaceful demonstrations against the Bahraini monarchy over its civil and human rights abuses in the troubled Persian Gulf Kingdom. Later in December, the Court of Appeals reduced the sentences to 2 years in prison. Meanwhile, dozens of mourners marched in a funeral procession for 14-year-old Sayyid Mahmoud Mohsen, who was killed by Saudi-backed security forces near Bahrain's capital, Manama, earlier this week. This as Amnesty International called on the Bahraini regime to launch a probe into the death of Mohsen.
Thousands of mourners marched behind the coffin of 14-year-old Sayyid Mahmoud Sayyid Mohsen, who was killed by Bahraini riot police after being fatally struck by birdshot. Mohsen was taking part in pro-democracy marches in the village of Sitra earlier this week when he was killed. Despite calls for an investigation into the incident, this footage reveals that the Saudi-backed security forces were shooting to kill. For its part, Amnesty International urged Manama to launch a probe into the death of Mohsen, as well as other cases involving the torture, ill treatment, and death of anti-government protesters at the hands of security forces. The group went on to accuse the Bahraini regime of whitewashing the cases in which the security forces were accused of killing protesters. In another statement issued on May 19th, it criticized the country for slow and inadequate investigations into past human rights abuses and continuing restrictions on freedom of expression, association, and assembly. More than 100 activists have been killed and thousands of others injured or arrested since the beginning of the uprising in 2011, but the violent crackdown by the authorities has been unable to suppress the voices of those who are demanding democratic reforms in the kingdom.
The power grab by Thailand's military has reached its summit. The coup leaders disbanded the country's Senate, placing all lawmaking responsibility in the hands of the army chief who led this week's coup.
Dismissing the Senate via announcement on national television, the latest move by the military effectively makes its leader, General Prayut Chan-o-cha, Thailand's ultimate decision-maker. Earlier, Thailand's powerful military, which deposed the civilian government on Thursday, announced that the former premier and dozens of other politicians will be released only when a solution to the ongoing political crisis is found.
We are able to find a common ground and seek for a common understanding among those present regarding how to resolve the situation in the country. We would release them for sure.
Meanwhile, sporadic protests flared across the capital Bangkok as scuffles broke out between demonstrators and security forces. hundreds of protesters descended on the symbolic Victory Monument, voicing their opposition to the military coup. But the voices of opposition are unlikely to change the course of events on the ground. A senior military source said that the Army Chief General Prayut Chan-o-cha had also submitted a letter outlining his actions to the revered king, whose blessing has traditionally been sought to legitimize Thailand's recurring military takeovers. King Bhumibol Adulyadej, now 86, commands great respect among his subjects, and his blessing for the coup would further strengthen Prayut's already formidable hand. Given the new circumstances in Thailand, civil liberties have been curbed, media restrictions imposed, most of the constitution abrogated, and rival political protesters cleared from Bangkok's streets, actions that the military believes will bring peace and stability back to the Southeast Asian country.
Well, let's talk a bit about the recent developments in Bahrain. With us to discuss this is Bahraini political activist Qasim Al-Hashmi, who joins us over the phone. Mr. Hashmi, why was Nabil Rajab released? Was it to save face with the international community?
Let's first describe what was Bahrain today. Bahrain was a real land of war. The Sitra area was surrounded by more than 2,000 military-equipped mercenaries to close the entrance of all that area, pretending people to reach the funeral of the martyr Sayyid Mahmoud. Plus, we've got Mr. Al-Abbar, his body has been in a fridge for over now 1.5 months. Mr. Nabil Rajab has already completed a 2 years, and he was sentenced to 2 years, and he completed them. He even completed more than 2 years. He was supposed, and he was only for he is being tweeting or mentioning the Prime Minister. I think today we expect a different move in Bahrain, because Nabil Rajab is out, and he will. We expect that he will try to redirect the demonstrators into Manama, the capital of Bahrain. I guess also the reason after his release is to send a message to international community from the Bahrain regime, saying that okay, he got an justice sentence. He go into the jail by that kind of sentence. He completed that sentence, and he was released accordingly. So at the end, they wanted to say, we are the constitution country, we are the law country. We do adhere to the law, and we do follow the majestic instruction. That is the second reason why Mr. Nabil Rajab has been released today.
Yes, but given that Nabil Rajab was just released, do you think he will immediately protest against the Khalifa regime? Won't he fear going back to prison?
I guess, yes. I think the Nabil Rajab is treated now, and he could be bold again at any moment. I do expect myself that he is a target at present, and he is focused by the regime, and any mistake that he pronounce, rather, even if he act like what he is doing, I mean, as a human rights activist, they will try to target, to focus on what he say or what he move, and I think they will pull him again with another, accusing him by another accused. I think he's a target. He's an easy target, and he could be again in jail.
All right, political activist Qasim Al-Hashmi, thank you for sharing your thoughts on this. You're watching AEE TV World News, still to come. The frontrunner in Egypt's presidential elections vows closer ties with Arab monarchies in the Persian Gulf. We'll tell you more after the break.
يابا، شايف هاي الأرض؟ شايفها يابا؟ هاي البلاد، هاي أرض سيدي وسيدك، هاي أرضك، هذا وطنك، هاي أرضنا يلي انحرمنا منها، هاي زتونتنا اللي بالسهل، هاي زتونتنا اللي بالسهل، هاي امك، ما في اغلى من الام يابا، ما في اغلى من فلسطين يابا.
Welcome back to Ali Tijah World News. Here's a reminder of our top stories. Ukraine gears up for presidential elections amid ongoing violence in the east of the country. Russia's President Vladimir Putin says he does not expect a new Cold War over Ukraine. Bahrain's leading human rights activist Nabil Rajab is freed after 2 years in prison, while the government continues its violent crackdown on dissent. And Thailand's military leaders disband the country's Senate, assuming all political power. The death toll from Friday's militant attack on an election rally in Syria's southern city of Daraa has risen to 37. Local sources said that 4 children were among the dead, while dozens of people are being treated for their injuries. Several rounds of mortar fire hit a tent where people gathered for an election rally in support of President Bashar al-Assad. The attack comes only days ahead of the presidential polls. Meanwhile, Syrian President Bashar al-Assad has thanked the Russian Federation for its support. The Syrian president made the comments during a meeting in Damascus with a Russian delegation led by Deputy Premier Dmitry Rogozin. Assad expressed his appreciation for Russia's support to the Syrian people in their war against terrorism, stressing the significance of Moscow's role in promoting global stability in the face of the Western attempts to impose its hegemony. Al-Qaeda militants launched a series of nighttime attacks against army camps and public buildings in southeastern Yemen, sparking fierce clashes which left at least 27 people dead. This as Al-Qaeda continues to fight back amid an ongoing government offensive in the country against the militant group.
Armed with rocket-propelled grenades, mortars and explosives, Al-Qaeda insurgents drove into Siam from the surrounding desert on 15 pickup trucks after detonating a car bomb at the entrance to the city in Hadramaut province. The militants targeted at least 7 locations, including the main military posts, the local police headquarters, bank branches, and the airport. Residents said that they heard explosions and gunfire throughout the night, adding that the city's electricity supply was cut during the attack. The militants briefly captured some buildings before withdrawing early in the morning. A local official, who spoke on condition of anonymity, said that at least 20 insurgents were killed during the ensuing clashes, along with 5 members of the security forces, as well as 2 soldiers. Local officials said they suspected the attack was led by Jalal Balaidi, a senior Al-Qaeda figure in the region. Activists reported that local hospitals in Sion have called for urgent blood donations in order to save dozens of wounded. Hadramaut province stretches from the port of Mukalla in the south of Yemen all the way to the Saudi border through arid valleys and empty desert, the type of landscape Al-Qaeda uses to its advantage across the Middle East. With a population of 25 million, the Yemeni government is trying to end 3 years of political unrest. In recent days, the military has claimed rapid victories against Al-Qaeda in the south of the country, but experts argue that the advances could be the result of a tactical retreat by militants in coordination with local tribes.
Earlier, we were joined by our Sana'a correspondent, Mohammed Al-Attab, who told us that the military operation against Al-Qaeda is proving to be a more difficult task than initially anticipated.
This military campaign only would like to drive out the Al-Qaeda militants from the southern region, where most of the oil rigs and oil explorations are taking place there. So they would like to drive them to the north side of Yemen in order to put the capital Sana'a between 2 fighting groups in the north and in the south. Also, most of the people are suspecting that the Al-Qaeda really is an organization that would like to fight in defense for Islam and Muslims. They think that it's just a tool that is being used by the United States of America in conspiracy with the Yemeni government in order to exhaust the country into different fights and within this war kill as many as Yemeni citizens who are innocent, who are not related or involved in this kind of ideology.
Hundreds of thousands of Shia Muslims from around the world converged on the holy Iraqi city of Kadhimiya to commemorate the martyrdom of the 7th Shia Imam, Musa ibn Ja'far al-Kadhim. Our Iraq correspondent Wissam al-Bayati was at those commemorations and filed the following report.
Millions of Shiite Muslims from across Iraq and other parts of the world converged to the holy city of Kadhimiya to mark the martyrdom of the 7th Shiite Imam, Musa ibn Ja'far al-Kadhim. The holy Imam was imprisoned by Khalifa Harun al-Rashid for several years before being martyred in captivity after being poisoned. For the pilgrims who come to attend the commemoration in Kadhimiya, which houses the shrine of the holy Imam, the gathering has many purposes.
Our physical presence in this holy place shows the unity of the Shia community in Iraq in particular, and the globe in general. We're here to renew our vows of loyalty to our holy 7th Imam and commemorate his martyrdom.
Our presence in this holy place is a sacred commitment. We believe in our Imam's cause, and we appreciate his sacrifice for the sake of his own people and his courage in facing a tyrant rule.
Others who traveled on foot for long distances from all across Iraq stressed that the ongoing terrorist attacks will not deprive them from participating in this spiritual event. Worshippers are hoping to send a strong message to the world that the Prophet, peace to be upon him, and his family members will continue to be the main unifying factor for Shiites across the globe.
When I left my home to come to the pilgrimage, the terrorism never crossed my mind. Even if it does, it will never deprive me from taking part in this spiritual ceremony. I am here to strengthen my vows with my holy Imam and sect and to show them my blind obedience.
The commemorations mark one of the holiest ceremonies in Iraq, with the Iraqi government doing its best to ensure the security and provide the necessary services to the pilgrims.
The pilgrims have stated that their participation in this pilgrimage is only to renew their loyalty to their holy Imam and describe the commemoration as a sacred one. Wissam al-Bati, Al-Ittijah, from the holy city of Qadimiyah.
Well, those commemorations marking the martyrdom of Imam Musa al-Kadhim are often plagued by terrorist attacks targeting the pilgrims. As a result, Iraqi authorities have imposed heavy security measures in the capital, Baghdad. Our correspondent Mustafa Qattan has that story.
Shiite pilgrims commemorating the martyrdom of Imam Musa al-Kadhim have braved the threats of terrorist attacks and the scorching heat to take part in this ceremony. Suicide bombers, car bombs and mortar rounds have targeted pilgrims in different areas of the capital Baghdad, killing more than 30 on Thursday and Friday. The heightened threat of further attacks has led to have authorities imposing heavy security measures across the capital, involving the closure of entire roads and barring certain vehicles from the streets.
All of the troops under the command of the Baghdad Operational Center are on high alert, and we have deployed the troops on the ground in and around the city of Qadimiyah. We have also deployed helicopters and reconnaissance aircraft to secure the ceremony from any possible threat.
Officials in the holy city of Qadimiyah, where these commemorations are being held, announced that the number of the pilgrims has exceeded expectations, but added that they possess the capability to provide the necessary services.
The turnout was more than expected. We have pilgrims from all over Iraq, European and Arab states, though our teams are ready to serve the pilgrims in the best way.
Despite the fact that terrorist groups have made a habit of targeting the pilgrimage in recent years, the violence has not been able to dissuade worshippers from taking part in the collective ritual.
We will never surrender to the wishes of the enemies of Ahl al-Bayt, who want to mute us through intimidation and threats. Such acts will make us even stronger and more resolute in our stances and beliefs.
And while militants have been stepping up their campaign of terror every year, many are hopeful that this year's security measures will be enough to prevent further bloodshed.
Pilgrims from all Iraq provinces have came to the holy city of Qadimiyah to emphasize a concept of fighting tyranny and injustice, and to send a worldwide message that the sacrifice of Ahl al-Bayt will live on. Mustafa Qattan, Al-Ittijah, from the holy shrine of Imam Musa al-Kadhim.
As Egypt braces for upcoming presidential elections, the frontrunner Abdel Fattah al-Sisi is hinting at the direction that his foreign policy may take. Sisi vowed to strengthen ties with Arab countries in the Persian Gulf, while expressing his gratitude to Saudi Arabia for propping up the Egyptian state.
Is there a leader in the past in Egypt or
Egypt's former army chief Abdel Fattah al-Sisi praised the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia and vowed to forge strong security ties with Arab states in the Persian Gulf. The first country I will visit will be Saudi Arabia, and we will go to express our gratitude to the custodian of the two holy mosques, for we will not forget his supportive stances and his statement backing the Egyptian people that led to a change in the political equation. Sisi also stressed that national security interests in both the Arab monarchies of the Persian Gulf and Egypt are interlinked, pledging his country's unlimited support to his benefactors. We will not allow anyone to tamper with the Gulf security. If there is any threat to any Gulf state, Egypt will not stand and watch. We are just a road's distance, and that means if any state is threatened and Egypt is asked to assist, then we will do so immediately.
So is there a particular level of turmoil?
But for the time being, at least, Egypt is facing turmoil much closer to home. On the issue of a spillover of violence from neighboring Libya, the army chief said that Cairo would not allow any terrorist operation to be launched from inside Libya.
Since the 2011 revolution, Egyptians have seen near non-stop protests, the toppling of 2 presidents, 6 elections, and a seemingly endless political crisis. But what they haven't witnessed yet is what has been demanded all along: a better economy. As the Arab world's most populous nation goes to the polls next week to elect a new president, Sisi insists this is something he can be trusted to deliver. For now, concerns regarding national security seem to be playing in Sisi's favor. However, Egypt's next leader will have to do more than make promises of a better future, as he will be expected to launch projects to help the masses and improve the already faltering economy.
A fresh wave of violence erupted in Turkey as thousands took to the streets of Istanbul to honour a man killed during clashes between protesters and police a day earlier. This as the country's embattled Prime Minister Recep Tayyip Erdogan braces himself for more anti-government demonstrations.
Overnight clashes have once again put Turkish Premier Recep Tayyip Erdogan's rule to the test. Battles between angry protesters and police raged on the streets of Istanbul for a second straight day. Riot police used tear gas and fired live rounds into the air in the city's troubled Okmidani district to disperse the demonstrators, who responded by throwing rocks and petrol bombs. As the unrest spread to other districts of the city, police used small grenades to quell the crowds. Fighting also broke out at the Middle East Technical University in the Turkish capital of Ankara, where students hurled stones and firework at police. The fighting began after government forces attacked a funeral procession for a man who was killed by police a day earlier. Around 400 people attended the funeral, with many accusing the state of murder. The man killed was the second to perish in this part of Istanbul, with authorities refusing to release information on the other man, who died of injuries sustained during Thursday's clashes. The violence in the neighborhood, which has seen periodic unrest since the 1990s, comes almost a year after protests in Istanbul triggered a summer of nationwide demonstrations, which challenged Prime Minister Erdogan's rule. But the embattled PM played down the reasons for the violence in the country.
Those who think that those protests are against me are deeply mistaken. Those who think that these attacks are carried out against my friends, our government, our political party, and the people who voted for us, they are making a big mistake. There is no doubt that these attacks are carried out against the people of this country, against the freedom, the beliefs, and the future of the people of this country.
For now, the government has been able to finally quell yet another anti-government rally, though at the cost of killing more people. The latest violence is likely to enrage the masses further, as another hot summer is anticipated in Turkey.
Pakistan's Premier Nawaz Sharif will attend the inauguration of India's Prime Minister-elect Narendra Modi, which is set to be held on Monday. A government spokesman said that Sharif will also hold talks with his Indian counterpart. The visit will mark the first time that a Pakistani premier visits India, which is aimed at alleviating tensions in the region. 3 separate bomb attacks in different parts of Pakistan have killed scores as the country's military steps up its campaign against Taliban insurgents. The first bombing struck a shopping centre in the capital Islamabad, killing 1 security guard and wounding another. The deadliest explosion targeted the northwestern village of Momand, where a roadside bomb detonated near an army convoy, leaving 6 security officials dead and 1 injured. The Brazilian government has announced a series of security measures to be taken during the upcoming FIFA World Cup in a bid to quell protests that threaten to disrupt the games. The Defense Ministry said it will mobilize 175,000 soldiers and police forces across 12 host cities. Naval and Air Force personnel will also be deployed, as well as special units that will be on a state of high alert. The announcement comes amid fresh rallies in Sao Paulo, where demonstrators protested against the high cost of the tournament. Pope Francis has arrived in the Jordanian capital for the first leg of his trip to the region, which will include a visit to occupied Palestine. The pontiff is set to hold Mass in Amman before meeting Syrian refugees in Jordan. This is the Pope's first visit to the Middle East, during which he is scheduled to meet with Christian families as well as political and religious leaders. His trip to occupied Al-Quds comes amid concerns that extremist Jews might disrupt the visit following acts of vandalism in several churches this week. Another bomb detonated outside the Somali parliament in central Mogadishu, leaving several people dead and scores of others injured. Police said that a massive car bomb went off near one of the building's gates, killing 4 security guards. 4 militants from the Al-Qaeda-linked Al-Shabaab group were also killed as heavy gunfire followed the blast. Al-Shabaab militants have vowed to step up operations against government targets in the area. In one of the world's wealthiest cities, the homeless are struggling to survive. Loaded down with huge plastic bags in frail shopping carts, New York's so-called canners crisscross the city night and day, scavenging trash bags, bins and cans and bottles.
Armed with a rickety shopping cart, Sylvanus has been collecting empty cans and bottles in New York for 5 years.
I will call my job recycling. I recycle. That's what we call ourselves.
For every recycled item, Sylvanus makes 5 cents.
If you start early in the morning till midnight, you probably will come up with at least $10 or $15 in your pocket.
I lost my job and my family, and I just end up in bad times, what I'm saying. The average, how much I make a day? $40 a day.
Jobless, homeless, or poor immigrants, these canners barely make ends meet. Sylvanus lost his job as a security guard after 9/11 and says collecting discarded items is the only way to survive.
It's a suffering job, like I say, it's nothing into it. But in order to redeem 1 can for 5 cents, you gotta work so hard for that. Picking up a can is the only choice that we can do in order to live a life here in New York City.
After scavenging around the city, canners exchange their goods for cash. Some head to local supermarkets, but are only allowed to claim up to $12 a day, so most prefer specialized redemption centers like this one. New York may be a city of millionaires, but it's also home to some 7,000 canners who make their living trading the city's trash, and competition is getting tough.
The group of canners is growing. Now I don't go to the street to pick up, but I hear their comments. They said, wow, I could not find any more cans. We are so many going to pick up cans. I can't find any more cans.
Up before garbage trucks make their rounds and off to bed late at night. Canners work tirelessly every day, and some for 7 days a week. Studies show they recycle up to 70% of New York's cans and bottles, traded for nickel after nickel to survive.
Right, here's a recap of tonight's top stories. Ukraine gears up for presidential elections amid ongoing violence in the east of the country. Russia's President Vladimir Putin says he does not expect a new Cold War over Ukraine. Bahrain's leading human rights activist Nabil Rajab is freed after 2 years in prison, while the government continues its violent crackdown on dissent. And Thailand's military leaders disband the country's Senate, assuming all political power. Well, that's all from me and the Al Ijah News team. Thank you very much for watching and good night.